Hello, welcome back to Ways of Reading. This is our series of conversations from Columbia College here at Columbia University about the books we read in literature humanities, the flagship literature seminar for Columbia College and General Studies students. I'm Joseph Howley. I'm a professor of classics, and I'm also the Paul Brooke Program Chair of Literature Humanities at the moment. And I'm really delighted to be joined today by Professor Josh Billings. Josh Billings is a professor of classics and comparative literature at Princeton University. He is the author most recently of The Philosophical Stage, Drama and Dialectic in Classical Athens. And he's joining us today to talk about one of the books we read in the fall semester, Aeschylus's Oresteia. Josh, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So we read the Oresteia, which is, if I'm remembering correctly, the only trilogy of Athenian tragedies that survives intact, the only complete trilogy that survives from antiquity. So we have other tragedies that were part of trilogies and we've lost the rest of the trilogy, but this one is the intact trilogy. And we read it after we're finished reading Homer. It'll be about halfway through the fall semester. I want to start by asking you the question I've been asking everyone in these videos. Do you remember the first time that you read the Oresteia?
So I remember the first time that I read it in Greek. I was in college, and I thought I learned Greek pretty well. I was pretty proud of myself that I was finally ready to read Aeschylus. And we began with the chorus's entrance. And I remember just reading it and understanding many of the words, but having absolutely no comprehension of what was going on. And I would read it again and again and again, and even when I understood the grammar, even when I could translate it, it was still incredibly challenging. I think Aeschylus's language is it's certainly the most challenging language from classical Greek poetry, and I think it's some of the most challenging poetic language of any poetry that I've ever read. It's just incredibly dense with ideas and images, and it's hard work, and it takes a lot of commitment to work through it and to really make sense of what's going on in it. And I have always found that to be an incredibly exciting challenge. I was I think intimidated by the difficulty of the text, but I was also really excited and intrigued by it. And I have continued to feel that way about it, even 20 years after I think I first read it.
Well, I think you're talking about reading the Greek. I certainly have had that experience with the Greek and continue to have it to some extent with the English. I think we read a pretty good translation, but I'm just looking here at the beginning of the first chorus's speech, and I'm not even sure, like, even in English, I think it would take a little while to figure out what's really going on here. So I guess,
and I'd say that's a sign of a good translation.
Yeah.
If the translation of Aeschylus is too easy to read, that means the translator is doing too much work for you. Yeah. This is a challenge, just as language, and a good translation of Aeschylus will convey some of that challenge, and I hope some of that excitement.
I think some of the takeaway then for our students might be, if they sit down and start reading Aeschylus and it doesn't immediately make sense to them, they shouldn't panic.
No, you're probably right on the right track if it doesn't make sense to you the first time. If you think it all makes sense, then I would have your head examined.
The beginning of the chorus's first lines, this is on like the third page, talks about Menelaus and Agamemnon. Mm-hmm. And it sort of begins setting the scene that it's been 10 years since the Greek army left for Troy. We're back in Agamemnon's home kingdom. And so, in my experience, students will often immediately recognize, oh, these are characters we know from the Homeric epics, but then also recognize that this text does not read anything like epic. So just in a kind of general sense, or in any relevant particular sense, what's changing as we move from epic poetry to tragedy?
Well, I think maybe the first place to the place to start there is that epic poetry is chanted by a single poet who gets up there in front of people, and as we have a scene of this portrayed in the Odyssey, where an epic poet is singing songs, and that poet goes on and on and on until basically people give up and go to bed. So its epic is a long story. It can expand and contract in a way at the will of the singer. And it's also, to stick with language, epic is a much more straightforward language. Epic language is written to be heard and processed very quickly. There's lots of speaking. Epic is a really, it's really sort of fun to read and to listen to, or it should be in a good translation. Drama is, as we know, enacted. And drama in ancient Greece comes around a couple of hundred years after the Homeric poems seem to take something like the form that we know them today. So drama is conventionally invented in around 520 BC. This is all deep in the past, where we don't have very reliable information. But it very quickly catches on in Athens. And Aeschylus is the first great poet of Greek drama whose works have survived. There were lots of other poets previously whose work had not survived. There were lots of other poets contemporaneously with Aeschylus whose works didn't survive. But Aeschylus, through a bunch of lucky chances, was the one whose works, the first one whose works have come down to us. What to say about the differences between drama and epic? First of all, you have multiple characters. And in the Oresteia, you have all of the characters played by 3 actors. And if you look carefully at the text, you'll find some very interesting moments where a third actor jumps up and starts speaking in places where you don't necessarily expect that actor to. That's partly because Aeschylus had probably relatively recently started using a third actor. Previously, drama was probably performed with 2 actors, and Aeschylus in the Oresteia is working with the new technology of the third actor and using it to convey some sorts of surprise often. And then I suppose the other really important formal innovation or distinctive quality of drama is the chorus. And Aeschylus is known for being the most choral of all the surviving Greek poets. Nearly half of the words in Aeschylus's plays are spoken by the chorus. The chorus would have been made up of 12 to 15 young men who would play who would be the chorus throughout the tetralogy. So there were not just 3 plays that we have, the trilogy of tragedies, but they would be followed by a 4th play, a satyr play, which in the case of the Oresteia we don't have. That play we know, though, was called the Proteus, and we can make some educated guesses about what it was about. I'll leave that to students who read the Odyssey and may remember some stories of Menelaus from there. The chorus is maybe you could say the real center of Greek drama as a form, and it does a lot of it plays a lot of different functions. It can act more like a character in the play, or it can act more like a sort of narrator, a sort of distanced figure, like, say, at the very beginning, when the chorus enters and they're telling us the story of what happened in the past, acting almost like an epic narrator. And it can also act like something sort of like it can speak in some ways as a mediating figure, mediating between the different characters on stage and also mediating between the characters and the audience watching, reacting like the audience would react, guiding or offering suggestions or ideas that the audience can respond to as they're watching the events on stage. So that's where I think I begin in thinking about the differences between epic and tragedy.
So we have suddenly a proliferation of voices.
Right.
Yeah.
Proliferation.
And we also have a text that in number of lines is much shorter than an epic.
Yes.
And go ahead.
Well, so it's very tragedy is really an art of compression. And we as you mentioned, the Oresteia is the only surviving trilogy. It takes up about, say, 3,500 lines. It may have been a little bit on the shorter side, so maybe you think 4,000 lines. The Odyssey is about, if I remember, 10,000 lines. So we're talking about something that's really much more compact and would be performed over the course of an entire day.
Mm-hmm. And we also have these associations in modern English. Like we could describe something as tragic or say that's a tragedy. And we often mean that, something sort of awful or pitiable has happened. When we're talking about Greek tragedy, we're talking about a literary or poetic genre with various formal conventions. How much of an overlap, or is there a useful overlap between sort of the poetic category of tragedy and our kind of common use of the word today?
Yeah. So I'll give you the scholar's answer, and then I'll give you a little bit, and then I'll give you a second answer. The scholar's answer is that there's not a lot of overlap, and that tragedy in ancient Greece does not mean that something bad needs to happen, although something bad very often does happen in Greek tragedies. It does not mean something that's wretched or very sad. When we talk about a terrible event as a tragedy, that would not make sense to a Greek. A tragedy for a Greek was, as you said, a literary form and not a real life event. Another way that people have used the word, one way that people have spoken about tragedy in modern times that may be familiar to students is the idea of a tragic hero or a tragic flaw. When I was in high school, I was told that tragedy had a tragic hero and a tragic hero had a tragic flaw. There's a long story behind this way of reading tragedy, but to make a long story short, it would not have made any sense to a Greek. A tragedy does not need a tragic hero. A tragedy can have multiple central figures. Tragic figures often have flaws, just like all human beings have flaws. But there's no need to hunt for a single tragic flaw or to try to isolate a single tragic hero. It's often, I think, a challenge in moving from high school to college English classes or English literature classes to get that conception out of people's heads. It certainly took me some time when I was learning to read tragedy in college literature classes.
Yeah, I had the same experience. I think in high school, I mean, I had a great English teacher in my senior year of high school, but I think just generally in high school, I came away from the study of literature feeling like I had been given these paradigms, and anytime I read a new book at school, I had to figure out how it fit into the paradigm, and that's what my teacher would want me to be able to explain. And I think something that's really exciting to me about a class like this is, we don't. I don't think we have that kind of expectation of our students. I really think of the ethos of this class as being, we'll put a book in front of you and we want to know what you make of it. Like, what is your
Yeah.
impression? What sense can you make of it? So I'm wondering then, if we're trying to kind of strip away our associations or our preconceptions about what is involved in tragedy, what kinds of, if we're going into reading the Oresteia and we want to think about what's different from epic, or
Mhm.
what is this genre capable of, or what sets it apart? Do you have tips for things we can kind of look out for as we're reading that would sort of be the things that set tragedy apart?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Let me point to two things that may actually be may be challenging, may not be obvious at
Hmm.
first. One is staging. Tragedy is put on stage. When we're reading tragedy, we should not just think of it as something that's happening in our mind's eye.
Hmm.
We should think of it as something that's happening on a stage. And we should be asking ourselves as we read it, how was this put on stage? And Aeschylus is, I would say, the most brilliant the most brilliant stagecraft of all of the surviving Greek tragedians. Aeschylus really was, I believe, a man of the theater and thought very carefully about space, about surprise, about time, um, about setting, and all of those things are aspects of tragedy that we have to supply ourselves when we read it. But I think it's a really exciting and fun aspect. The other thing I'd point to, and there's lots to say, is that every line in epic is written in the same meter. And that is to say that all those 10,000 lines of the Odyssey, every one has roughly the same rhythm. Tragedy is written in many, many different meters. There's one meter that's principally used for what we're going to call dialogue, which is probably spoken or declaimed, somewhat like we'd expect characters in a modern drama to speak or declaim. Some of it is chanted in a way that I'm not sure that we have a great analogy for, maybe recitative if you know musical drama, and some of it is sung, and it can be sung by one person and it can be sung by the chorus. And so paying a close attention to the way that those different modes of speech alternate is one of the places where you can really see tragedy and using the full resources of drama and resources that epic doesn't possess.
The story of the Oresteia follows the family of Agamemnon, the so-called one branch of the so-called House of Atreus. And just to orient our audience who are maybe picking it up for the first time, the first play, the Agamemnon, describes Agamemnon coming home, and his wife Clytemnestra is waiting for him, and she's still very unhappy about the circumstances under which he had departed 10 years previously, which are narrated in a flashback that I always find very, very vivid and intense. And a spoiler alert: Agamemnon dies. And in the second play, the libation bearers, his son, who has been in exile, comes home and confronts his mother, Clytemnestra, and then, here's another spoiler, kills her. And then in the third play, the Eumenides, we find Orestes, the son, a fugitive from the Furies, the gods or demons or whatever of divine retribution, and he comes and takes refuge in the city of Athens. And this is, to me, always a very striking bridge that this narrative sequence draws. It starts with the same world that the Odyssey is set in, the world of heroes coming home from Troy, and ends literally in the city where the audience would have watched it being staged. So there's something that always strikes me about this tragedy in particular, the way it seems to sort of build a bridge from the old stories and the old traditions to what we have to think of as the modern, the very modern, and in some ways the very urgent. Is that a helpful way of thinking about it?
Yes, absolutely. And I'd only emphasize that that's something that Aeschylus' Oresteia does that no other tragedy that survives does. There are lots of ways that other tragedies might sort of look forward very subtly in time, from the sort of deep mythical past to the Athenian present. So all of the tragedies that survived are performed in the 5th century, the 400s BCE in Athens. So they're performed for a specific community. They're very popular and they quickly spread beyond that community, but they're first performed for a specific community at a specific time, and actually in very close proximity to one another. Our entire history of classical Greek tragedy spans less than 70 years. Maybe another point that you raised there is just to emphasize the distance between the contemporary world and the events that Aeschylus and other tragedians are portraying. Early on in the history of tragedy, there seem to have been plays written about recent events, and we have one of them. The earliest surviving tragedy is Aeschylus's play about the Battle of Salamis. But very quickly, tragedy stopped portraying recent events and started and only portrayed events from the very deep past. So there's always in tragedy a sort of jarring effect as you see characters from the very deep past on stage and speaking in ways and often speaking about issues that were very, very current in Athens. But only Aeschylus' Oresteia takes that sort of formal quality of the work and that kind of tension between the past and the present and builds that bridge that you described. And to think about why he does that and how he does that is really one of the exciting challenges of thinking about the Oresteia.
So I sometimes think that there's two ways, these are two kind of, each of these is oversimplified, but there's two kind of oversimplified ways that I like to think about what Aeschylus is setting out to do when he writes the Oresteia. And one would be the kind of like, sometimes my students call it fan fiction. You imagine him sitting down with all the characters from the Trojan myth cycle and thinking,
absolutely,
what's a new thing I can do with this? Right. And then the other way of thinking about it is him sitting down with some interest he has in the modern world, something he wants to talk about in the Athens that he shares with his audience, and rifling through his books and thinking, okay, which story from mythology would let me talk about this thing?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it's probably a bit of a combination of the two. It's some way that Aeschylus found a story that articulated something he wanted to articulate about his present time, but also probably that in articulating that thing through the story actually taught him more, I would think. And it certainly, I think, taught the Athenians more about the issues that they might have been thinking about already. That is, I don't think we should just read this as a play with a single message. We should read it as a play that's centered around really important issues, but that doesn't necessarily tell you what to think about those issues.
Yeah, I try to remind my students always that it's often much more productive to ask ourselves what question is the text asking rather than what claims is it making or what does the author think. Do you have a sense of like some of the big questions you think Aeschylus is asking in these plays?
Yeah, I think Aeschylus is asking a lot of big questions. I think one very big question that may be less obvious comes from the very first word of the trilogy, in Greek theos, gods. I think Aeschylus is thinking about the way that divinity, that divine plans for human beings affect human action. He's thinking about the extent to which human beings are free, the extent to which they're determined by the gods or by circumstances or by their own will. So that's one theme that's very important to me. I think Aeschylus is thinking a lot, and this is quite closely connected to the gods, to justice, thinking a lot about justice. If you read this text in Greek, especially, you will see that words for justice, words connected to the Greek word for justice, dk, turn up all over the place. So and I've sometimes taught this text in a class about what justice is. And I think it's one of the most profound inquiries into what's just and what's unjust and how to think about justice that has ever been created. And then I suppose the third big theme that I would point to, and there are many, many more that you could think about, has to do with community, with the institution of the city-state, which we eventually get to in the third play when we reach Athens. But the community beginning really with the chorus of the Agamemnon and running right through that wonderful celebration of Athens at the end of the Eumenides, thinking about the relation between rulers and their communities, thinking about the responsibilities that individuals within a community have to one another, thinking about the way that communities should respond to injustice, to violence, and what it is that allows communities to survive violent interruptions in their sort of fabric, like we have repeatedly in the Oresteia. And I take, in a sense, that to be a question that so the community is, in a way, where those questions, I think, about human agency and the gods, and where those questions about justice and injustice really play out in Aeschylus. That is, I think Aeschylus is much more interested in what the story of Agamemnon and Orestes and Clytemnestra tells us about Athens in 458 BC than he is interested in deciding who was right and wrong back in the deep mythical past of the Homeric age.
So this will be something that our students will maybe have already started to think about in the Iliad, which of course begins with this argument between Agamemnon and Achilles, and there's a we don't always talk about this in terms of justice per se, but there's a sense of claiming some kind of reparation or restoration for a wrong having been done, and we see that later in the Iliad on the shield of Achilles, where there's this depiction of human society, that one of the things that's happening in this kind of paradigmatic city is that there's a trial going on, and people are trying to figure out what's the appropriate restoration for, I think it's a murder in that case. What we see in the first play of the Oresteia is Clytemnestra killing Agamemnon in retribution for sacrificing their daughter to enable the fleet, the Greek fleet, to go to Troy. And then in the libation bearers, Orestes murders his mother as punishment for murdering his father. And we see a very clear, almost like a hyper obvious depiction of a sort of blood for blood approach to justice, right?
We see exactly that, as the chorus says at the beginning of the central song in the libation bearers.
Right. And by the end, or even by the climax of the third play, when Orestes has come to Athens, we see the establishment of a court and a trial and a jury. And I think students often pick up pretty quickly that the way that this jury trial plays out doesn't always inspire a great deal of confidence in the legal system. But one of the things that does seem to be staged is sort of an emergence from a kind of an older, imagined sense of and simpler sense of what justice is, justice being retribution, to a sense that, well, we have modern institutions now that can replace retributive violence as the only form of justice, but then immediately start asking questions about how well those institutions serve our needs.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to be sensitive to the things in that apparent resolution. I mean, this is a text that has tons of loose ends, but they're often a little bit below the surface. But I think it's really important to be sensitive to those loose ends, because that's in a way where this play or this trilogy is not just a celebration that, thank God, we're no longer those barbarians who just killed one another. And I think the play is telling a story of development, of change within a society. And at some points, it suggests that change is progress and it's a good thing. But there are also a lot of places where you might wonder whether they've actually figured it out, whether this system that's instituted at the end of the play is actually a just system. And I just add one thing to what you said, which is that we see as the play goes on and these questions of justice and retribution and sort of adjudication come on, we see these always through the lens of the chorus, through the lens of a community of people who are surrounding. And so it's not, I think, merely a question about what happens to Agamemnon, what happens to Clytemnestra, but really it's a question of how a community is involved in these issues of justice.
And that community, the community represented by the chorus in the first play, is the elders, the old men of Argos, who, I don't know, we might think of as the sort of I don't know, maybe the traditional ruling class who are sitting back and watching the palace intrigue unfold. But most interestingly, in the second play, the chorus is the enslaved women who work in the royal household.
Right.
And it's so striking to me that is the lens, the community perspective through which we're invited to watch these events unfold.
Absolutely. And that chorus is It's very easy often when you're reading this trilogy to kind of skip over the libation bearers, but I think that play and that chorus is really one of the most interesting pieces of the entire trilogy, because just as you're saying, they really represent figures who have suffered injustice and who are thinking really hard about how to restore some sense of balance to a world that seems quite profoundly out of whack. You can look to their discussion with Electra at the very beginning of the play to sort of see that back and forth, how each is thinking about justice.
When we begin the Iliad, sometimes readers immediately want to engage with the fight between Achilles and Agamemnon over this wrong, and then invariably I have other readers who say, "Hold on, they're fighting over an enslaved woman. They're fighting over treating a woman as a piece of property." This trilogy, the Oresteia, is very interested in women, and it has women who do terrible things. It has women who are allowed to speak in ways that will be very surprising and striking to the readers of Homer. And it even has a central figure in the third play is a goddess whose gender is kind of put on the table, I think, much more than is traditionally the case in epic. I'm about to ask you a question that would require at least 2 more hours to answer fully, but what do we need to know about the place of women in 5th century Athens to read what's going on here accurately?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right to ask that question, to point to the importance of women, and not just the importance of sort of women qua actors, but actually thinking about women as thinking about the role of women in society. There's a lot of discourse about gender in this play, or in this trilogy, from really the very, very first speech to the very end. What to know about women in Athens? Athens is one of the most, maybe not the most, but Athens is a highly repressive, highly gender segregated society. Citizenship was extremely limited, and women were essentially disenfranchised from any form of civic participation in the Athenian democracy. Women's roles were, insofar as they had public roles, they were largely confined to religious events, and the sort of familiar women in public would have been religious figures like the Pythia that we meet at the very beginning of the Humanities. The audience of Greek tragedy was certainly largely made up of men. There's a debate about whether some women may have been in the audience, but if there were not very many of them. So you should really think of this as a play written by men and primarily for men, and performed, I should have said, entirely by men. So all of the women's roles were played by male actors. And so I think one of the things that all sort of leads one to think about is, with women so far from the center of Athenian society, what does it mean to put on stage such strong women in the Oresteia? What does it mean for this trilogy to be thinking so powerfully and in such complex ways about the role of women in society? That I think is a really interesting topic to think more about as you read.
I think that's one that we'll find a lot of time to explore in the classroom, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
I have one final question here, and this is sort of starting to look in another direction. But when we were talking about what sets tragedy apart from epic, we were talking about how tragedy has different voices, different characters, different voices in dialogue. And after we read the Oresteia, we're going to read another piece of literature from classical Athens. We're going to read Plato's Symposium. And I think readers might not necessarily think that these two texts would have a lot in common. Their interests seem to be very different. We say this one's tragedy, that one's philosophy. One of them is about, justice and the world of myth, and the other one is a philosophical discourse on the nature of love. But just in terms of the kind of history of literature and literary form, I always want to say, look, this is another polyvocal text. We've gone from tragedy, where you have characters on stage talking, to philosophical dialogue, where you have characters on stage talking. So is there any helpful way to think about Oresteia and Symposium either as being products of the same context or as being in part of the same sort of literary history?
Yeah, it's a great question. One I've thought a lot about. So there's a story that Plato initially wanted to be a tragedian. And when he met Socrates, this wonderful charismatic figure in the history of philosophy, he burned his tragedies and decided to follow Socrates. And if you read further in Plato, you'll find that Plato does not have very positive things to say about tragedy or epic, really. He doesn't seem to be a big friend of literature, but a lot of what's going on there, I think, in Plato is that he's in competition with drama. And he's in competition, as you say, not just as another form that is based on polyvocality, Platonic drama, as I like to think about it, unlike tragedy, can actually include any number of people. Tragedy is a very limited number of people who can speak on stage, whereas the Symposium can have 6, 7, 8 speakers, and each one can have a point of view. So Platonic voices and Platonic settings can actually be much more varied than tragedy can. It doesn't have the same formal constraints. But I think there's a sort of even a deeper continuity, which gets sort of more at the rivalry that Plato feels, and that in the history of philosophy, philosophy has felt towards literature and especially tragedy. And that is that in the 5th century in Athens, before there were lots of philosophical texts, before philosophy was even known as a discipline, if you wanted to think about big questions in life, big existential questions, you went to the theater. You also went to Homeric performances, but the theater was the place where people thought together about what was most important in their lives. And so I take what philosophy is doing, and especially the sort of polyvocality of philosophy, to be simply taking over the questions that theater had asked and asking them in a different way. And the other thing, one of the things that I find so interesting about this sort of continuity and also this discontinuity between Plato and tragedy is that, like tragedy, Platonic dialogue does not tell you who's right. Platonic dialogue does not give you always, maybe sometimes it does, an authoritative voice. It leads, it opens up more questions than it answers. And that to me seems to be the way to think about what's going on in tragedy and in philosophy as being part of a culture that was asking questions, big questions, the same questions in many ways that we ask today, but doing it very often in these different literary forms.
I think that leaves us with a really productive and exciting way of reading anything we read in this class, which is that as we're following the arguments or the questions or the imagery or the poetry of what we're reading, and as we think about what is this text asking, we can also think about what are the elements of how this text is written, of the genre the author has chosen, of the direction they've taken. What are the elements of that literary project that enable it to ask these questions? Why is this the form in which we had to ask this question or explore this topic or this idea? And this is something that can carry us all the way through, I think, the rest of our course.
Absolutely.
Well, Josh Billings, thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us today about the Oresteia and a little about the symposium.
My pleasure. I hope you and all of your students really enjoy reading them.
I think we will. Thank you.
Take care.